Haaland was one of the standout players at this year's World Cup, and something about his athleticism combined with how chill he was while being in USA made me want to actually look into him properly instead of just watching the highlights. Every clip of him online gets captioned with a brain emoji and some hashtag about elite mentality, and after enough of that, the whole thing starts to feel like branding rather than an actual person saying actual things. So I went back to the source material instead, real press conferences, real sit-downs, actual footage stretching from his early years at Dortmund through Manchester City and into this summer's tournament. I should say up front, I didn't watch literally every interview the guy has ever given. Nobody could realistically claim that. The title's a bit of an exaggeration, the way people say they've seen every episode of a show when they mean they went deep on it. But I went deep enough across enough years that something actually started repeating, and once I noticed it, I kept finding more evidence of the same thing in places I wasn't expecting it. Part of what made this research different from other players I've looked at is that Haaland's public career is still relatively short, barely 6 years of top-level football, which means there isn't decades of footage to sift through the way there would be for someone further along. That actually made it easier in some ways because the sample size is small enough that a handful of genuinely high-stakes moments carry a lot more weight, and it's easier to notice when his behavior in one of them contradicts or confirms what he did in another. The first thing that made me pause wasn't a viral soundbite. It was a small line about what he actually focuses on as a striker, something he said more than once across different interviews over the years. His focus, in his own words, isn't really on scoring, it's on getting into the positions where a chance becomes available in the first place, with the scoring itself, following from that as almost a byproduct. That's a subtle distinction if you're only half listening, but it means he's treating his own movement and positioning as the thing he actually controls rather than judging himself purely on the number that ends up on the scoreboard. He's also talked about liking to step outside his comfort zone, deliberately saying it helps him develop as a person and not just as a player. And there's a line from an old interview where he says flatly that he can improve everything, that whatever he's already good at, he can still get better at. None of this struck me as particularly deep on its own. Footballers say versions of these lines constantly. It's close to a standard press conference answer at this level of the sport. Then I found the meditation story from 2020, and that's when I actually started taking real notes instead of half watching in the background. March 2020, Haaland is 19, playing for Borussia Dortmund against PSG in the Champions League round of 16, a genuinely huge stage for a teenager still new to European football. In the first leg at Signal Iduna Park, he scores twice, and after the second goal, he sits down on the pitch and does a mock meditation pose, legs crossed, eyes shut, completely still, while the stadium goes off around him. He told a reporter afterward that he genuinely enjoys meditation, that it makes him feel calm and gives him a sense of tranquility, and that's part of why he sometimes celebrates that way. PSG won the second leg 2-0 to go through on aggregate, and Neymar, still visibly annoyed from the first leg, scored and immediately copied the meditation pose back at him in front of the home crowd. The whole PSG squad then did the pose together after the final whistle, and Mbappe filmed all of them doing it again afterward in the locker room, posted straight to social media within the hour. Haaland's own father called the whole thing classless in the press, which is an understandable reaction from a parent watching his teenage son get mocked publicly by one of the biggest squads in Europe. What actually caught my attention was Haaland's own response a bit later, in a sit-down with ESPN, because I expected some kind of diplomatic non-answer, the usual line athletes give when a question is clearly trying to bait them into something. Instead, he said PSG had basically helped him spread meditation to the whole world, and that he was thankful to them for it, with no edge in how he said it, as far as I could tell from the transcript. I read that a few times because it didn't fit the shape I was expecting going in. A teenager mocked on camera by one of the biggest squads on the continent thanks them for the attention instead of firing back. That's the first moment in this whole research process where I actually felt something shift, less amusement and more genuine surprise, because that kind of response is hard to fake convincingly at 19 years old. There's a smaller detail in that same story I almost skipped past too, which is that the celebration itself came from something he says he was already doing privately long before it ever became a public moment mocked by an entire opposing squad. He wasn't performing for an audience the first time he sat down on that pitch in Dortmund. He'd already built the habit into his own routine, and the cameras just happened to be there when he used it. That ordering matters, to me. A habit that predates anyone watching and survives being mocked afterward carries a different kind of weight than something invented purely for effect in front of a camera. It also means the response to being mocked wasn't really a decision he made in the moment, weighing how it would look to forgive PSG publicly. It was more like an extension of a habit he'd already committed to well before that specific test arrived. That's a useful thing to notice early in this research because it changes how I read everything that came afterward, less as individual choices made under pressure and more as a standing default he simply kept applying whenever a new situation came along. I wanted to know if this composure held up under something with higher stakes than a mocking celebration, though, so I kept looking, and that's when I found a game that complicated the picture I'd been building. March 14th, 2023, Manchester City against RB Leipzig, Champions League round of 16, second leg. Haaland scores 5 goals in 63 minutes, including a first-half hat-trick in a 7-0 win. That equaled Messi's record for goals in a single Champions League knockout game. Guardiola substituted him with half an hour still to play, and Haaland later admitted he'd told Pep in the moment that he'd have loved to stay on and try for a sixth. Guardiola's explanation for the substitution afterward carried real weight underneath the joke, saying that if Haaland set that record at 22, his life would end up boring since he'd have nothing left to chase. He'd already broken City's own single-season scoring record that night too, one that had stood since 1928, and equaled Messi's mark for a knockout match, all before Guardiola pulled him off with the game long since decided. After the match on CBS Sports Golazo with Thierry Henry, Jamie Carragher, and Micah Richards, Haaland was visibly frustrated he hadn't scored more, saying he could have had 2 extra goals in the first half if he'd read a pass differently. He said, in his own words, that he has to always try to reach for more and stay hungry, because someone else scoring 5 goals might already feel satisfied, but he wasn't going to let himself settle there. Piers Morgan, watching the same broadcast, tweeted that the most terrifying thing about Haaland was that he was genuinely angry about missing more chances after a 5-goal night, calling it a stunning winner's mentality. I sat with that one for a while because it sits right alongside the meditation story from 3 years earlier without fully matching it, and I've come to think both things are simply true about the same person at once. The calm doesn't erase the hunger underneath it. There's a genuinely restless competitive engine running the whole time, and it clearly doesn't go quiet just because the scoreline already looks finished from the outside. There's another detail from that same night that sharpens this even further, easy to miss if you're only chasing the big quote. The record he was 1 goal away from that night, 6 goals in a single Champions League match, has never belonged to anyone in the competition's history. So the same player who shrugs off losing the Ballon d'Or to Messi, calling him the best to ever play without any visible bitterness, is also the player quietly hunting a record that nobody has ever held. The awards he waves off tend to be voted ceremonial, decided by captains and journalists in a room somewhere months after the fact, which is a slower, more abstract kind of measurement than what's actually happening on a scoreboard in real time. The things he actually chases in the moment are countable, visible, happening right in front of him, existing or not existing the second the final whistle blows. I don't think that's a contradiction so much as a fairly precise definition of what he's actually competing against, which, as far as I can tell, is never really about outdoing another player's reputation. It's about whatever the number in front of him currently says, which is a distinction that took me a while to actually notice clearly. The awards conversation itself is worth spending more time on too, because it's one of the only places you can watch him talk about a rival directly with real stakes attached. 2023, City wins the treble, Haaland finishes the season with 52 goals across all competitions, and he still loses both the Ballon d'Or and the FIFA Best Award to Messi that year. Messi hadn't even had that dominant a club season by comparison. He was mostly still riding the World Cup win with Argentina from a few months earlier into those votes. There was real pundit frustration about the result too. People on air arguing these awards were losing credibility. If a season like Haaland's could lose out to something built mostly on reputation and a recent World Cup medal. Asked about it directly in a press conference, Haaland didn't dodge the question, but he also didn't take the obvious opening in front of him to throw any shade at Messi or the voting process. He said Messi won the World Cup, called him the best to ever play the sport, and left it there without any visible resentment in how he said it. I don't think that's a rehearsed line, mostly because he's repeated some version of it more than once across different settings, and saying the same thing consistently, without variation, is usually a decent sign someone actually believes it. It's also worth noting he wasn't some unknown quantity being generous about a distant rival either. The two of them were tied on points in that particular vote, separated only by which players' captains happened to rank him higher. That's about as close as an individual award can get to a coin flip, and it would have been an easy, defensible moment to sound at least a little frustrated about the margin, especially with a full domestic and European treble sitting behind him that season. Guardiola himself has said publicly that he believes Haaland has the mindset needed to eventually rival Messi and Ronaldo's career scoring numbers, which is a fairly extraordinary thing for a manager to say about a player still in his mid-20s. That's not really a claim about talent. Since nobody doubts the talent at this point, it's specifically a claim about mindset coming from someone who's coached him closely enough to actually judge that rather than guess at it from outside. I wanted to know if that generosity held up in a moment with even higher personal stakes, though, which brought me to the Thierry Henry clip from right after City completed the treble in 2023. He's on the CBS Sports Golazo panel, fresh off winning literally everything a club player can win in a single season, and he asks Henry directly for advice on improving his right foot. Henry tells him straightforwardly that sharpening that foot would make him even more lethal going forward, and Haaland takes the note in without any defensiveness, genuinely engaged with it in the moment. That's a striking thing to do, right after the best possible outcome a season can produce, going looking for a weakness instead of just sitting in the win for a while. It lines up with something else he said about deliberately managing his own mental load, which I think is the piece that actually explains the calm best out of everything I found. He's talked about liking to do a lot of things, specifically to turn off what he calls his football head, saying it's important so you don't get burned out, because being a footballer under that much pressure is genuinely difficult. That's a different claim than simply being naturally relaxed. It sounds closer to a maintenance routine, something deliberately built and repeated, aimed at protecting his mental state rather than just describing his personality. It matches what teammates say about him off camera too, which is where the calm reputation actually gets tested for me the most, away from prepared answers in a press room. Norway international Haitham Alisami, who played alongside him early in his career, described him as humble and calm, but hungry, someone who can be completely locked in during a game and then switch off entirely right after the final whistle. City teammate Nathan Ake has described something similar from inside the dressing room, talking about constant training ground banter where players hammer each other with jokes, and Haaland fitting into that culture immediately without any ego about it. Man City CEO Ferran Soriano, who spent years around Messi during his time at Barcelona, offered a specific comparison worth quoting directly, since it's coming from someone who's actually worked closely with more than one all-time great, rather than a fan guessing from the outside. Soriano described Ronaldo as someone who'd visibly resent a teammate's scoring instead of him, driven by how deep his own hunger runs, and then described Haaland as someone who genuinely enjoys watching his teammates score too. That distinction suggests his calm has a direction to it, kept narrow and pointed almost entirely at his own game, instead of spreading outward into resentment of the people playing alongside him. Maintaining that also means the switch has to work in both directions, locked in during the 90 minutes and loose again right after, which takes real sustained effort rather than a permanently even temperament. A player who ran cold all the time wouldn't have been visibly annoyed about missing a sixth goal in a 7-0 win, and a player running purely on obsession wouldn't be genuinely happy watching someone else score instead of him. Holding both of those at once, on a schedule, game after game, season after season, is the part of this whole thing I find hardest to fully explain, and it's what actually pulled me toward this summer's tournament. It's worth pausing on how unusual that combination actually is in a sport built almost entirely around visible emotion, where celebrations, arguments with referees, and post-match interviews all tend to reward whoever performs the strongest reaction in the moment. Most of the highest profile strikers in the modern game have built their public identity around some version of intensity on display, whether that's Ronaldo's fury at himself for a missed chance or Neymar's theatrical response to contact. Haaland's version of intensity mostly stays contained to the actual playing of the game itself, showing up in a frustrated comment to Guardiola on the sideline rather than in a public display built for the cameras afterward. Norway hadn't reached a World Cup in 28 years. Haaland had said publicly more than once that getting his country there mattered to him more than any individual trophy he could win with a club. He basically got them there by himself in qualifying too. 16 goals, 8 more than anyone else in the entire competition, including 2 goals in 2 minutes in the deciding match in Milan against Italy. In an interview with FIFA ahead of the tournament, he talked about never having experienced a World Cup as a kid growing up in Norway, saying he was always rooting for some other country because his own never qualified. He said he was happy for Norwegian kids to finally watch their own team play and won, since he would have loved that himself as a child, and there's nothing calculated sounding about how he says it. That's a different register from most of what else came up in this research, plainer and more sentimental, and it only seems to show up around this one subject, country and childhood, rather than around club trophies or scoring records. Norway had a genuinely historic run once they got there too, beating 5-time champions Brazil in the round of 16, reaching the quarterfinals for the first time in the country's entire World Cup history. He scored in every single group stage match, then again in the round of 32 and against Brazil, 7 goals across 4 straight matches heading into the quarterfinal, keeping pace with Messi and Mbappe near the top of the Golden Boot race the whole tournament. That build-up matters going into the England match, because the quarterfinal wasn't some early exit where nerves could explain a quiet night. This was a player fully in form at the exact moment the stakes reached the highest point of his career. There was a lighter thread running through that build-up too, since his own City teammate Jude Bellingham was playing for England, and reporters covering the tie noted their friendship was effectively on hold for the 90 minutes. Asked whether he'd be cheering for England given how many City teammates were on that side, Haaland gave a wry, non-committal smile, mentioned growing up in England and owning an England shirt as his first ever jersey, then admitted it wasn't that simple anymore given who he was actually playing for now. That's a small, honest hedge rather than a clean answer either way, and it's worth mentioning mostly because it shows the same instinct at work in a much lower stakes moment, acknowledging a complicated feeling instead of flattening it into a soundbite. England neutralized him almost completely though. 2 shots on target the entire match, 9 passes attempted before he was substituted at the end of the first period of extra time, visibly exhausted. Norway had actually led the game too before England's Jude Bellingham equalized in first half stoppage time and scored the winner in extra time, sending England through 2-1 and ending Norway's run. That's about as difficult as an individual performance can go in the single biggest match of a career, shut down almost entirely on the exact stage that mattered more to him than any other stage he'd ever stood on. What he did afterward is the part the official FIFA World Cup site itself flagged as unusual, and it's worth sitting on rather than skimming past. Most elite players, losing from a winning position and getting eliminated at that stage, retreat into silence, which is a completely understandable response to that kind of loss. Haaland grabbed the post-match interview microphone himself and did the interview smiling, according to the reporter standing right there with him at the time. He said the whole experience felt surreal, that it had changed him as a person, that watching World Cups from the sidelines his whole life and finally living one firsthand was incredibly special, even attached to that specific result. He also talked about the unity the run had created back home and said the tournament had put Norway on the map in a sport where nobody had expected them to be relevant again this soon. A day or two later, he posted a photo of himself with a raccoon he'd apparently found somewhere, captioned, "It followed me home," a small, dumb, human detail that made me laugh reading about it in the middle of taking notes. I sat with that sequence for a while because on paper it's strange. Get personally shut down on the biggest stage of a career, then smile for the cameras, then post about a raccoon within 48 hours of elimination. Everything else in his record up to that point argues for taking that at face value though. The PSG response at 19, the Henry moment, the way teammates independently describe him switching off after games. The emotional regulation reads less like a performance for cameras and more like an operating setting he's built for himself over several years in public, tested repeatedly under increasingly higher stakes without visibly cracking on camera, at least not yet. I don't want to pretend that settles the question completely though, because there's something underneath all of this the interviews don't fully answer. Whether the calm reflects a genuinely well-adjusted person who happens to also be one of the best strikers alive, or whether it's a controlled distance from his own results that would look a lot less admirable up close in a genuinely bad season without a World Cup story to soften it afterward. The Leipzig game complicates this too, in a way I keep coming back to, since a person who's simply content wouldn't have looked that frustrated about a missed 6th goal in a match already won by 6. Maybe the more accurate way to put it is that the hunger is constant and the calm is the thing he's built on top of it deliberately to keep functioning across a schedule that's demanding. I don't have a clip of him losing badly personally on a stage that mattered and reacting with anything other than composure eventually, so I can't rule out that the composure might crack somewhere I just haven't found in the public record yet. There's one more piece worth mentioning because it's the closest he comes to naming the whole thing directly in his own words rather than through a comparison someone else made about him. Talking about the Vikings, a subject he's clearly drawn to, he said he likes the mentality of not caring about the outcome, just going somewhere and getting the job done, along with the togetherness they had while doing it. He was careful in the same breath to say plenty of what the Vikings actually did historically wasn't good, a small but real piece of self-awareness rather than just borrowing the aesthetic without thinking about what it actually means. That's about as close as he gets to naming his own operating mode out loud, and it's phrased as indifference to outcome paired with total commitment to the process rather than anything close to fear or dread. If you'd asked me at the start of all this whether there was a real pattern here or whether the calm was mostly branding, I would have leaned toward branding and said so without much hesitation. I don't think that anymore. The PSG response at 19, the Henry ask, right after winning everything, the Messi comments, the raccoon photo 2 days after the worst loss of his career. Those are too consistent across too many years and too many different kinds of stakes to be something he only switches on when reporters happen to be in the room. The Leipzig night keeps me from calling it pure serenity though, since that's a guy who was genuinely visibly upset about 5 goals not being 6 in a match his team had already won by a landslide. The pattern, if I had to state it plainly, is a chosen distance between his sense of self and both his failures and his wins. Built deliberately and tested repeatedly at increasingly high stakes without ever fully breaking on camera, at least not yet. The goals, the record chases, the right foot Henry mentioned, those he clearly claims as his own responsibility, worth getting frustrated about, worth staying hungry over even after a 5-goal night. The trophies voted on by other people, the comparisons to Messi, the result of a single knockout match against a very good England side, seem to sit in a different category for him, acknowledged and felt, but not absorbed into how he sees himself afterward. That's a hard thing to fake consistently across 6 years of cameras, and it's the actual reason I stopped being skeptical somewhere around the raccoon photo. Not because a photo of a raccoon proves anything on its own, but because it's exactly the kind of small, unguarded, low-stakes moment where a performance usually slips, and this one only slipped into being mildly ridiculous. Most of the moments I looked at across this research carried real stakes attached: a mocking rival squad, a missed record, a lost award, a World Cup elimination, and the composure held in every single one. The raccoon photo is different specifically because nothing was riding on it at all. There was no audience expecting a particular reaction, no reporter waiting with a microphone, just a man posting a picture of an animal he apparently found on his way home. That it still came out lighthearted and a little goofy rather than curated or careful is a small piece of evidence that the whole demeanor isn't something switched on, specifically for cameras and interviews. I went into this expecting a brand and came out with something closer to an actual load-bearing habit of mind, built specifically for a schedule and a level of scrutiny that would wear most people down a lot faster than it seems to be wearing him down. Whether it holds up the same way years from now, once the goals inevitably slow the way they eventually do for every striker, isn't something this research can answer yet. Careers in football tend to reveal character most clearly on the way down rather than on the way up, once the body starts losing a step and the headlines stop being automatic. Everything gathered here comes from the ascending part of his career, still climbing, still adding trophies and records faster than most players manage in a full decade, which is worth remembering before treating any of this as a finished conclusion. Nobody stays on that kind of trajectory forever, and the interviews that actually matter most for a question like this one might not exist yet. For now, the closest thing I have to a conclusion is that the calm is real, the hunger underneath it is also real, and so far he's been unusually consistent about keeping either one from running the whole show by itself. That's not a small thing to pull off in a sport this public, where every camera is waiting for exactly the reaction that would prove one side of that balance had finally won out over the other. There's a version of this piece I could have written that just stacked up the smiling interviews and called it a personality, which is basically what most of the content already circulating about him does. Scroll through enough of those clips and the calm starts to feel pre-packaged, a trait assigned to him by other people rather than something he actually built himself over time. I think that version misses the actual interesting part, which is that the smiling only means something because it survived contact with genuine provocation, genuine disappointment, and the single worst result of his career so far without changing shape each time. A personality doesn't usually hold that steady across a mocking celebration, a missed record, a lost award, and a World Cup elimination spread across 6 years and multiple countries, without at least one visible crack showing up somewhere in the footage. I looked for that cavity. I didn't find one yet, though I'd be surprised if it never shows up at all, since nobody manages a career this long without eventually hitting a result that tests them harder than anything so far, and I look forward to see how he handles it.